This is another Off the Record podcast with your guest host, Sergey, where we interview great founders and venture capitalists. I have a great guest today for you guys, Scott Absher, who started his career in product development and support. And right now he's a co-founder and chief executive officer at ShiftPixie, which is a gig platform that to keep your schedule filled with local on-demand workforce. Scott, welcome to the show. Thank you for coming.
Sergey, good to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Well, tell us, I want to start with ShiftPixie. How does it actually work? What's the whole premise of the platform that you're developing?
Sure. Yeah, when we started the company back in June of 2015, both my co-founder and I had a background in the human capital management space. Mm-hmm. And what we did was we helped small to mid-sized companies navigate all the rules and regulations and all the duties that employers have as it relates to employees. And a lot of people don't know, they haven't been on the ownership side of a business where they had employees that there are a lot of requirements between employer side taxes that most people don't know about. The employers also have responsibilities for providing workers' compensation coverage, securing that with an outside carrier in case somebody's hurt on the job. That's the sole remedy for any kind of workplace injury. But there's also some 60 different government agencies, both state and federal, that have an interest in you as a business owner and how you conduct yourself as an employer. And so we would come to small companies like that, usually between 20 and 50 employees, and we would take over their entire HR stack. So we would handle all the administration, all the reporting, all the taxes, the workers' compensation. We would provide and administer all the benefits, whether they were retirement benefits or health benefits. And we would do this over and over again. And the interesting thing about that business and what I loved about it is, number one, we were liberating these business operators to do what they did best. Because when you become an employer, nobody's good at that stuff. And so they had a chance to get it out of their nest and on the other side of the firewall to really protect the business. Because if you fail on some of those things, they have repercussions that actually could pierce the corporate veil if you failed on some of those things. So that was a great business to be in. And we loved the best thing you could hear in that business in those days was, I wouldn't be in business today if it weren't for you. And that's really gratifying. And it was a narrow margin business, but it was reoccurring revenue, and you could over time stack hundreds or thousands of these types of clients. And it was a great business to be in. One of the rules of thumb in that business was that we stayed away from any business that had high part-time labor reliance. And that would be businesses like restaurants or retail and some of the service industries. And the reason for that was, if I'm handling your entire HR stack, I can't make any money with you if you have high turnover. In the old days, the tradition was that if you had a high reliance on part-time labor in those industries I described, you could expect 100% turnover. And so it meant that I'm doing a lot of hand-holding, a lot of administration, and a lot of work where I'm already making a very thin margin. And then I'm also losing two areas of monetization, which would be health benefits and retirement benefits, because part-time labor generally does not have those as part of the package. So we all stayed away from them. When I met my co-founder, he was neck deep in that kind of business. And I told him at the time, I thought he was crazy. And he said, no, because you guys won't come after this market. So I get to work this market all by myself. And he was right, because none of us were going to go after that. But he called me in May of 2015 and said, there's a problem in the marketplace. And I don't know exactly what it is. And he said that for the first time in his career, spanning over 30 years, that clients, his restaurant clients, were asking him if they could help him find them employees. And he said, I've never been asked that in 30 years, because that's not what we do. We're not in the recruiting or the search business or the placement business. But it wasn't just one, it was all of those clients. And their rationale was, you're in Southern California, we're in Southern California, you have a lot of us in the same area, and surely you guys have got to know where we can find more employees. And so his idea was to take these silos, these service silos that we put clients in, and break them just a little bit so that they could share a scheduling layer of technology on top. And then by doing that, they could open up their shifts to this population that we had on the platform. And he went back to them and said, do you think this would work? They all loved it and wanted to have it. So when he called me about that, lightning struck. Because in my world, I was working with, and I went to market through a lot of large property and casualty insurance agents, particularly in Southern California. And I was one of those resources that they had a client or a risk, as they would refer to these clients, that was difficult to place. They would come to me and say, and it was for workers' compensation purposes, they would bring me these weird risks that they couldn't place. And I had a call from one of my agents in LA that said, hey, Mr. Workers' Comp Guru, I got one for you. See if you can figure this out. And what he started to unpack for me, he said, these guys want to know, number one, if they have a work comp risk, because they have a strange business model with an irregular labor component. But if they do, how do you meter it? Because of how they do this, they have an unreliable and very flexible labor component that in workers' compensation is always pegged to the hourly labor rate. That's how it's metered out in the market. And so he started the conversation with explaining that these guys are sort of like a taxi company, but they don't really own any equipment. He said what they do is they let people that have cars connect with people who are looking for rides over a mobile phone. And I remember the first time I heard that concept, who would do that? Who would let a stranger in their car, get in the car with a stranger? But nonetheless, we spent the time, I spent the time listening to their workflow, their business, and how they captured an opportunity, how they turned it into work, and how that work was performed, and then ultimately how it was compensated for. And my report to them was, they said, listen, in all 50 states, you would have a workers' comp exposure based on your description. And I also, as part of that mission, we came up with a way to micrometer that coverage on a per shift basis. And so they deliberated on that, and they came back and they said, well, we appreciate your analysis and your work on this, but our lawyers tell us that we don't have an exposure because we're treating them as 1099s. I said, look, whatever you tell the IRS and you're using that as your standard, that's just one piece of the puzzle. Insurance commissioners in all 50 states have a very different opinion about that, and they don't look at it that way. And I said, so I'm going to give you some advice or some comments in parting. Number one, you would not be the first company to spend a lot of money on bad legal advice. Second, and it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, that traveling through the market in what the insurance industry calls bear and not having coverage, and then finally trying to secure and put in coverage in place, oftentimes you have to go back retroactively. These state insurance commissioners can make you go back retroactively to the beginning of your business and contribute all the premium you should have contributed into the system. And I said, and that's something your attorneys don't know. And I said, and it's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when. And that company was Lyft. And I remember coming away from that conversation, and I started having other ones with a lot of these other gig platforms that were emerging, and they were essentially flipping the middle finger off to all the federal and state regulators, saying, we're not an employer, we're not going to do this. And they scoffed at all this decades, 50 years really of settled employment law. And we knew people that went to jail for breaking some of those things before. So we saw when he called me with that opportunity, I said, this is going to be much bigger than you know. I said, we're going to take and build very elegant cloud-based mobile SaaS technology that's going to take and deliver everything we know about compliance one shift at a time. And as we got into that into that mission, and we started bringing and boarding clients, to manually run their business before our technology was fully ready, we started to do a lot more digging and found out why we were seeing this high level of turnover. And we found out was the old tradition of 100% turnover had actually gone to 300 and 400% in these industries. And we saw the gating reason for that. And it all started really in 2009, in March of 2009, with the birth of Uber. Uber completely changed the rules of engagement. And now they created an opportunity for anybody that was dedicated to working part-time or flexibly. Now they could do so by just flipping on their smartphone. That's and right. You also saw from between 2009 and 2015, this big in smartphone usage. So that's why now when 2015 arrives, all of these brick and mortar operators are now competing for this very finite number of part-time workers in the U.S. So that's what we went out to try and do, is to go out and cure toxic turnover.
Wow, that's that's a very lucrative place to be in, and it definitely solves a massive problem of how do you actually navigate this whole place around. But do you feel, Scott, that right now, even if we're talking part-time, there are not enough workers, there are not enough qualified people to actually do the job, especially as we get everybody working from home?
Yep. Yeah, in fact, what I just described for you, this Uber and this gig platform phenomenon, that created what we call or consider the first wave of human capital markets disruption. So that was very profound. But COVID created a second wave of human capital market disruption. What happened was all of a sudden, and I'll use the restaurant industry as an example, just because we're entrenched there, is all of a sudden people that were working in those jobs got unmoored from the companies they were working for, the jobs that they had, and dining rooms were closing, and so people were separating from. And we thought that PPP loans were going to kind of restore order there. They didn't. A lot of these operators pocketed the PPP money and never used it to bring people back to work. So that kind of failed in its execution. But what created a third immediate wave behind that of human capital markets disruption were the government subsidies. They were subsidizing people to stay at home and stay away from work. And then as business started climbing out post-COVID, nobody was going back to work. So we're still kind of swimming in that third wave of disruption, where people are they're doing two things. Number one, they're saying, do I really want to go back to doing that work that I used to do? Or do I want to find something else to do? So not only did you have toxic levels of turnover, now they just can't find people. And there's major disruption in the human capital markets. And it actually set us on a path to really build a much better mousetrap and a much better approach to that in our business. But it's clearly a major upheaval.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem like to stop. I mean, we had conversations around gig economy in before, when Uber was just coming along, then Lyft came about. Like, right. Everybody's going to be in the future, everybody's be doing gig economy, flip their smartphone, do the work for whatever the time they want, and then they'll be good. So totally different model. But then nobody predicted COVID, and that whole thing accelerated so much. And on the full-time market, then folks who are, let's say, developers, probably the most, the biggest example, like anybody, all the US firms hiring developers from there, they pay in the US prices or the US salaries, and then nobody else could actually, they suck out the whole talent from the world, effectively, or from countries like Canada, for example. So that creates a tremendously difficult situation. Yes, it does.
Yeah, we're seeing this across the spectrum. One of the things that, as I said, we're kind of building a better mousetrap for this. One of the things that
how does that work? How does that actually work, Scott? Like, how do you look at it? The whole model.
Sure. So what we do is we think a lot about two user experiences. One is that of the person that's working part-time. How do they want to survey opportunity, look at opportunity? How do they want to connect with opportunity? And how do they want to get paid for opportunity? So we spend a lot of time creating a very rich user experience from the time they onboard and they get into our system, and they get into a schedule, and they get into a rhythm. Part of the problem with some of the gig platforms is the amount of income that you can make. I'm told that the average earner on say Uber, for example, makes about $600 to $700 a month, and it's not reliable income. What we're trying to do is establish a platform that's tied to regular brick and mortar work activity, where somebody can make a much more stable income. So, as an example, on our platform, the average earner is making over $2,000 a month, and also able to do it very flexibly. So that's kind of the goal there. But what we did in building our technology, we were at a state of readiness finally the fall of last year. When we started building this, I knew that we would have a very big opportunity in the temporary staffing industry, because they too, that's the other half of the part-time labor population. And that's a very old business that has not been technically adapted to the new market. And in fact, they never had to. They didn't have to use elegant technology to communicate with their clients or with the people that were doing the work. So there was never a need for them to make that investment. So I knew that once we were at a state of readiness, that we would have a high value to temporary staffing companies. And so late last year, we started boarding our first temporary staffing companies. But also what happened to us, we're a very tiny micro cap public company, but we have an investment banking relationship that's very fond of what we're doing. And they had approached us about doing some merger and acquisition work to accelerate our growth. And I wasn't really keen on doing that. I occupy most of our capital table, so I didn't want to do anything that would be dilutive over time. Totally. So what I did see, though, at the end of last year was the SPAC market heated up. And if people don't know what those are, SPACs are special purpose acquisition companies that are set up, registered with the SEC as a blank check company, and then they're funded by investors, and with the mission of going out and making an acquisition, or in our case, a number of acquisitions. And so I went to our bankers with that proposition. I said, listen, here's a way to accelerate our growth, not use our own cap table, but what if we were to set up a SPAC and we'd go out and roll up a national footprint in industrial staffing, because there's very few national leaders, and there's a lot of really strong regional players. We'll go out, acquire them, put them into bolt them together into a national footprint. They came back to us. They said they loved the idea. I told them I'd need about a $250 million commitment. They made that commitment. And then I pushed it a little further. I said, listen, there's some subsets of the staffing industry that we could also affect change by operating on our technology. And I suggested medical staffing, which they made a commitment for another $250 million there, and then also technology staffing. But I also pushed them for a fourth SPAC commitment, and I said it was for a commercial insurance company, because one of the things that we've learned on our journey is that if workers' compensation is not in the right alignment with the business, especially in staffing, they have some vulnerabilities there, that they can't get coverage, or they can't move into new markets without permission from a carrier. They can't go after certain types of clients because they need carrier permission. I said, what if we built a commercial insurance company that would benefit from the collective premium from all of these companies, but also it could liberate them to really grow friction-free. They could go into new markets. They could go after different types of clients. And so they made a commitment to all four SPACs, and we very recently closed the first one of those. What we did in going to the market, we right-sized those. We went from 250 million to 100 million because it was more in step with the marketplace. So we recently completed about a month ago industrial human capital. It was 100 million that we were looking for. It was actually over. There was accelerated interest in it. We had over $350 million worth of interest in our $100 million deal. So it was, we got it closed very nicely. But more importantly, when we went on the roadshow for industrial human capital and explained what we were doing and how ShiftPixie as the sponsor was in building mega clients for ourselves, and they could see the exponential revenue growth, explosive revenue growth for us. They could see that our motive for doing this and our interests were directly in line with the SPAC. And they all said, we've never seen this before. This is one of the best use cases for a SPAC we've ever seen. And what I tell people is that another way of looking at this would be if Tesla were to sponsor a SPAC, and the money that they raised, they went out and acquired both Hertz and Avis, got rid of the fossil fleet and put an all EV fleet in there. Right. I said, that's kind of what we're doing. We're building a mega client and doing that. For us, we have a run rate of about $100 million a year right now. This is going when we get into the de-SPAC process, which is going to happen in first quarter of 22. Our run rate runs up to over $1 billion suddenly, and our net profit we're EBITDA negative today because we run so much money into R&D. Now we go the other way, and that's just with the first one. So we've got it's going to be a great year for us, but. What we also learned in that process, Sergey, was that, and we didn't expect this. Number one, we started to see like these acquisition targets that were rolling up, that they took the dip in the beginning of COVID, but then they immediately shot out afterwards to levels higher than they were in 2019. We also learned how dependent the Fortune 1000 is on this type of agile or flexible human capital. The Fortune 1000 clients kept popping up in our due diligence work. And as we're putting things together, at the end of the day, we're going to be delighting these types of clients, because the other side of the user experience that we're focused on is giving somebody that relies on itinerant or flexible staffing real-time business intelligence on any market in the US. They don't have that today. They have to go digging for it. They have to do make phone calls. And if you're a national, think of any big box retailer, and you rely on this type of capital, and we didn't human capital. We didn't realize that companies like Walmart, Target, Amazon, FedEx, they all rely on flexible labor coming in and out that's not really on their books or on their full-time payroll. But they have to, in order for them to manage this nationally, they end up having to manage dozens of relationships in all these markets around the country. They can't have a single source. So now they can. They'll have a single place where they can look at any market and fix a human capital issue as it emerges in real time. And that doesn't exist in the marketplace today. So that's what I mean by upping our game and really changing our approach to the work in the human capital markets.
How do you look at, Scott, at the actual the workforce from a perspective of building their profile, building their presence? Because from what I understand, it's not just necessarily one gig, and it could be more of a retainer sort of engagement, depending on what the other side, the Fortune 1000 clients actually want. Like, how do you build that discoverability of the workforce, like the rating system or review system? Because I'm sure you thought about that for quite a lot, and that's what makes Amazon guys and Uber guys really as good as they are.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we've seen is I described the legacy side of human capital in the staffing industry. Again, no one's made significant investments in technology. It's very monochromatic. So there's limited data, there's limited visualization of opportunity. Everything's very limited. What we're trying to do is provide this high definition view of opportunity, how to connect to that opportunity, how to put yourself in a position to access more opportunity, how to use this platform to cobble together a better than average income, and that doesn't exist today. So and really our inspiration for that was all these gig platforms and the way they were creating better connections and creating and curating better opportunity and and allowing stakeholders on both sides to have much more visibility and much more real-time data. So we're essentially copying what they're doing to again create much better user experiences for people on the workforce, but also people that rely on these people in the workforce.
Totally, yeah. And I mean, we as an agency, as a product studio, we do get some help on like from Fiverr, from Upwork, for example, for our marketing. But a lot of times, what comes up, and it is a challenge. Sometimes you'll find a really great person that you work with, but then they disappear, or they're overbooked. So it's that lack of consistency, which is still an issue because you could get some great people, but then there's like, for example, you want to do a bulk order, you want to do like,
Sure.
or maybe you just book somebody for a lot longer than they expected, and that becomes an issue, or sometimes the quality drops. So there's still some of that to dial in.
Well, part of what we're doing, you're pointing out one of the things that is probably a sore spot for all the stakeholders, and it's on project-based work. I think you're always going to have that where people are drifting from projects that interest them. In the part-time labor markets, we're really looking at a blue-collar dynamic, and what those people are looking for is reliable income. That I know I can show up, get paid, and so on. What we've also done, though, in that process is we've used AI to keep the engagement active. So, for example, if somebody's adrift, we want to find out why they're adrift, and AI will nudge them in presenting opportunities. And if we see that somebody's disconnected, the system has the ability to communicate with them, and if they're permanently adrift, they go off the platform. But the whole idea is using AI to poke at all those regular intervals in a work week. And again, it's all geared to part-time blue-collar labor,
right,
where the skill set's different. On the creative side, listen, if I'm a creative, I'm gonna probably track to the projects that either I'm really creatively engaged with, that motivate me, right? That where I'd work on those projects whether I got paid or not, because they're passion projects. Or on the other side of the spectrum, said this one pays more. And I think that's what you're going to start seeing in that market, in the creative market, but also in the part-time labor markets. In fact, wages are already escalating. It's really funny. Without legislation, we now have a new national minimum wage of at least $15 an hour. And we think that that's going to settle more at 20. And that's, again, supply and demand. Right now, the workforce is carrying the balance of power. So if you're doing creative work, you hold the power. If you're doing software development, you hold the power. If you're doing blue-collar labor, you hold the power, and it's going to be reflected in wages, but also flexibility.
Where do you see, Scott, all this workforce or the future of workforce going? Like, what is going to be, how is it going to be different in the future? Let's say a couple of years from now, not 5, but because it's a little too far, but a couple of years from now, hopefully COVID is under control. Like, how is it going to be different? We're probably going to stick, a lot of the people will stick remotely because it just makes sense. Now they've got a taste for it. But like, how do you see, like, what is going to be a biggest landscape shift?
I think what you're going to see is people rethinking work. Why? Let's starting off with the fundamental question: why do I work? And what work do I want to do? It was very funny. I think growing up the way I did, my parents' generation, which would have been the post World War II generation, I was never understood. I would jump from job to job to job. I was one of these serial learners. Once I was in a job and I learned everything that I was going to be allowed to learn. And I mean that by people put you in a box, like you just learn 100%. This, you stay here. 100%. And I wanted to learn more. And once I realized that I had learned everything I was going to learn, I moved on to the next one. And my parents and my in-laws always looked at me as unstable. But what I was doing was stacking experiences and learning and building really for the work I do today. All of these things, accumulating those experiences. So I think you're going to start seeing the workforce look at things that way, where what's my next challenge? And one of the things we try to do, even internally here, is we try to find ways for people to expand their opportunity here. Take what they've learned so far and let them look at the next horizon. Say, I'd like to participate on that side of the business, and make a path for them to do that. And I think any employer that's not doing that, allowing people to be motivated by their passions, because what happens is, and there's actually a psychology profile. You should look at it sometime. I think you'd find it fascinating. It's called the System for Identifying Motivated Abilities, SIMA. And this was written by and discovered by a fellow at Fermilab in Chicago. His job at Fermilab, the particle accelerator, for back in the 60s and 70s, I think his name was Art Friedman, or I think that's what his name was. But what he was doing, whenever they had a project that was funded by the Department of Defense, they would take this project, they break it apart, and what they did from an HR perspective, a recruiting perspective, was to find PhDs that wrote on this particular aspect of particle physics, right? That was related to this project. So that's how they would pull together their teams for this project. What they found was these teams had really bad outcomes, disharmony, a lot of, they just couldn't get a bunch of propeller heads all on the same page. Right. But what he found out was that with a very simple method, he could conduct an interview that would allow him to find out what this person's motivated abilities, because just because they wrote their doctoral dissertation on this minute aspect of particle science, it didn't mean they were passionate about it. They just learned about it. They squirreled away the facts, right? So what he did is his process was that he would ask them, he'd give them an interviewer would call them and give them some homework. Say, tomorrow we're going to conduct our interview, and I want you to think about. Go back to when you were a kid, and I want you to tell me a story about an activity that you did that you were really good at and that you really enjoyed, whether anybody noticed it or not. And then I want you to go to junior high, and I want you to tell me that story. And then I want you to go to high school, tell me that story. And then another checkpoint in life, and tell me those stories. And from those stories, from them telling, I did this thing and I really enjoyed it, I was really good at it. Yeah. What emerged was their motivated ability. And what he then tried to do was to link people on these projects to their motivated ability. What they found was that people will work tirelessly and without income. They didn't care. They were passionate about this project. And I'll give you an example of that. When Michael Jordan came to the NBA, one of the things that NBA players are not allowed to do is play pickup games for the obvious reason they could get hurt, you know. And so don't go back to the old neighborhood and play ball with your pickup game with your old high school buddies. Don't do that. Michael Jordan insisted that he had a love of the game clause in his contract, and he fought them on that. And what he said was, "You don't understand. I have to play basketball. Whether you paid me or not, I have to play basketball." And Tiger Woods was like that with golf. Right. I just have to do this. And these are, and when you can link somebody's passion and motivation to the occupation, you get Michael Jordan's and Tiger Woods. So that's, I think the next challenge, especially for anybody that's relying on thought workers and that sort of thing. And think about it in like software development. There are some people that might be blockchain developers just because that's what they have to do, but they would rather be creative. And we find that in our business all the time because we have developers and creatives as part of our employee mix. And we, and not that we do it today, but it's something we talk about a lot, but we really want to follow people's passions and get them plugged in just because of that very thing, that they will work tirelessly and their passion will drive them farther than a paycheck. And I think that's the way you're going to start seeing the workforce change, again, especially with thought workers and white collar workers.
Yeah, that will be pretty significant, especially considering now there was a stat, I'm sure there's still this still relevant now, that 70, 80, or even more than 80% of people are not happy with their job. Right. That's kind of a depressing stat, but it is true, like, because they end up being in that job because there's a need, and then the more time they actually spend, then you're locked in, and you have this this time you spent, and you don't really want to start over. That becomes, and then also maybe you can't because you have mortgage or something.
Well, this is the other thing too that I worry about with this work from home situation. And in fact, I just had a conversation with our CTO this morning. Technology has always been adapted for people to work remotely and all that, but anthropologically, we're not wired that way. No. And we talk about that, with like our CMO, Amy Wang, about this all the time. She has more the creative burden of the company. And it's the idea that some of these things, you need FaceTime. And I don't mean technical FaceTime. I mean legitimate FaceTime. That's how we're wired. That's how we were made. And when you push against how we were made, and push us into a box. People, I'll give you an example. People start living inside their head. They're not interacting with people. They're not having physical connection. Being very present with them, with their coworkers, and that's where I worry about like project drift and things like that, where somebody's not able to do their job. Now, technology, if you're writing code, that industry's already been adapted to that. And if you're a code jockey, you need quiet, you need to be isolated, you need to, head down, hands on keys to get your work done. But there are other occupations that are probably not as well adapted to that. And I look at like creative industries, it's just, so I don't know how that gets reconciled over time. And again, you've got this slipping away, and you got passions being disconnected. So we're in a murky place to be sure through all of this. COVID really opened up some wounds, I think.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, I don't believe you can do great creative work by being isolated. It just doesn't work. Like especially because the creative ideas and the execution, there is no roadmap. If you're trying to create a video, or if you're trying to create a marketing campaign, yes, you could take a template and go from Google or copy paste it, and it's going to be mediocre. It's going to be what it is. But if you're trying to create something that really pops, it is much harder to do on Zoom or online. You could, but it's much harder. And so it's that simulation that you're talking about.
Well, that's, we experience that as a company. In fact, we re-headquartered our company last year from Southern California to Miami, as you can see in the background here.
Beautiful, by the way.
There were some surprises that came from that. We did this operationally and functionally because there were some things that we were doing to expand the business that made it smart to move down here. But one of the things that we didn't expect, and I had lots of interviews with CNBC and others that were wanting to know why the move from California to Florida. And aside from some of the obvious, one of the big surprises was that I initially went to Southern California from Chicago. Chicago is a very old, stodgy business climate, always has been. It's a miracle to me to see companies like Groupon and Grubhub emerge out of that market, because that wasn't the kind of market it was. When I went to Southern California over 25 years ago, the first thing that was very obvious to me was the outlook and optimism, and how much capital was flowing and how much new industry was percolating and bubbling. Just a huge cauldron of activity in Southern California in the mid 90s. And it was palpable, and optimism was high, outlook was high. But that all came to a crash in 2008 with the collapse of the housing market. There were a lot of companies that were central to the mortgage crisis that were based there in Orange County, where we were. But what happened was this collapse, and people went into just survival mode, and businesses did that, and it never came back. And so one of the surprises when we came down here to Miami was all of a sudden it was that same type of optimism, that bright outlook and all that here in Miami, and all the creative juices are flowing. And for us, that actually, it kind of changed our thinking about our business and about consumers. And we have two parts of our business: the human capital part, where we manage human capital, but another piece that we built based on all of our learning with restaurant brands and operators. We found some major holes in their way of thinking and the way they connect with consumers. So we went to work to build and add to our technology stack a mobile ordering platform that sits on top of Square. Square is our partner on this, that allows us to take and build virtual brands. And part of what we did with our incubator ghost kitchen operation that we opened up down here, we saw an opportunity to do something that nobody else was doing. We saw that with COVID.
Scott, I'm gonna pause you there because we're just gonna run out of time, because I'm actually using my personal Zoom account, which is a bit of a problem. So we are going to cut it there. Thank you, Scott, for joining. Thank you guys for listening in. This is another episode of Off the Record Show. We will be back with another great guest.